Fix this floating money pit by Friday, and I'll marry you. It was a joke, a cynical, exhausted jab from a billionaire who bought people for a living. She didn't expect the scruffy mechanic to wipe the grease from his hands, hold her gaze, and quietly say, "Deal." Sweat pooled at the base of Vivian's neck, sticking the collar of her $2,000 silk blouse to her skin. The Fort Lauderdale heat was a physical weight, thick with the smell of low tide, rotting kelp, and stagnant diesel. She pressed her phone harder against her ear, trying to drown out the screech of a nearby angle grinder. "I don't care what the supply chain issue is, Robert. If the acquisition isn't finalized by Monday morning, I will personally dissolve your department. Get it done." She ended the call without waiting for a response, her thumb digging into the screen. A headache was forming right behind her left eye, a sharp, pulsing throb she knew intimately. It was the physical manifestation of losing control, and Vivienne absolutely hated losing control. She looked up at the Paragon, 120 feet of pristine Italian fiberglass, custom-milled teak decks, and twin MTU engines that were currently dead in the water, her sanctuary. The only place on Earth where the board of directors couldn't find her, now reduced to a very expensive paperweight bobbing in a secondary, run-down marina, because her usual elite shipyard was booked solid. She marched down the concrete pier, her heels clicking aggressively against the cracked pavement. She stopped at slip 44. The man she was looking for wasn't standing on the dock to greet her. He was waist-deep in the engine bay of a rusted-out trawler, his back to her. "Excuse me," Vivienne snapped. The man didn't move. A wrench clanked against metal. "Are you the mechanic? Arthur said you were the only one who could look at a twin-turbo diesel today." Slowly, the man straightened up. He didn't rush. He grabbed a soiled red rag from the deck and wiped his hands, taking his time to work the grease out from under his fingernails. When he finally turned around, Vivienne felt a momentary, annoying stutter in her chest. He was entirely the wrong sort of person to be at her disposal. He didn't have the eager, slightly fearful look of the contractors she usually hired. His face was unshaven, lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from physical labor, not boardroom stress. His hands were huge, scarred, and stained black at the knuckles. He smelled of WD-40, old coffee, and sea salt. "I'm Caleb," he said. His voice was a low rumble that barely competed with the sounds of the marina. He didn't ask her name. He didn't look at her Birkin bag or the Audemars Piguet watch on her wrist. His pale grey eyes flicked over her shoulder to the Paragon, taking in the sleek lines with a professional, entirely unimpressed assessment. Spun bearing? Cracked manifold. At least, that's what the useless technician in Miami told me before he said it would take a month to source the part. Vivienne crossed her arms. "I need it running by Friday. I'm taking it to the Bahamas for the weekend. It is non-negotiable." Caleb tossed the rag onto a nearby crate. "Everything is negotiable, but a custom manifold for an Italian block in 3 days, that's not a negotiation. That's a miracle. I don't pay for miracles. I pay for results." Vivienne pulled out her checkbook, a gesture that usually made men like him stand up a little straighter. "Name your price. Double your usual rate, triple it. Just get on the boat and fix it." Caleb leaned against a wooden piling. He looked at the checkbook, then back up at her face. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement? Pity? It made Vivienne's blood run hot. I don't care about your money, lady, he said quietly. I've got 3 boats ahead of you. Commercial guys, fishermen who actually need their rigs to feed their families. Your weekend tan can wait. The headache spiked. Vivian gripped the leather of her bag until her knuckles turned white. She was running on 4 hours of sleep, a diet of black espresso, and the suffocating pressure of a $10 billion merger. She was not going to be lectured by a guy whose boots were held together by duct tape. Look, she breathed, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. I have dealt with men in suits who think they can tell me no all week. I am not doing it with a grease monkey. Fix this floating money pit by Friday and I'll marry you. I'll give you half my estate. Just make the damn engine turn over. It was a joke, a cynical, bitter, completely unhinged exaggeration born of pure exhaustion. She expected him to roll his eyes. She expected him to tell her to screw off. Instead, Caleb stopped wiping his hands. He stood up fully, towering over her by a good 6 inches. He stepped closer. The smell of oil and sweat grew stronger, surprisingly grounded and human compared to the sterile, air-conditioned air she lived in. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. The amusement was gone. Friday at noon, Caleb said, his voice flat. Leave the keys with the harbour master. Before Vivienne could process the response, he turned his back on her and slid back into the bowels of the trawler. Tuesday morning brought a humidity so dense it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. Vivienne sat at the glass dining table in the Paragon's main salon, a spreadsheet of shipping logistics glowing on her laptop screen. She wasn't reading it. She was listening. Clank, screech, thud. The sounds from the engine room beneath her feet were jarring, violating the pristine silence she usually demanded on board. Caleb had arrived at 6 a.m. He hadn't knocked. He had simply boarded, unlocked the heavy steel hatch to the engine room, and disappeared. But he hadn't come alone. Sitting on the $40,000 custom silk blend rug in the corner of the salon was a child, a girl, maybe 6 years old, wearing denim overalls and a yellow t-shirt that had a noticeable ketchup stain on the collar. She was entirely engrossed in a violently pink coloring book, humming a tuneless song under her breath. Vivienne stared at the child. She didn't know what to do with children. They were unpredictable. They were sticky. They broke things. My babysitter had a flat tire, Caleb had told her earlier, hauling a massive red toolbox over the gunnel. He hadn't asked for permission. He had just pointed a greasy finger at the girl. This is Maya. She knows the rules. She won't touch your stuff. For the last 2 hours, Maya had been terrifyingly well-behaved, which somehow made Vivienne more anxious. A sharp curse echoed up from the engine room, followed by the heavy clang of metal hitting metal. Maya didn't even flinch. She just picked up a blue crayon and started aggressively shading a unicorn. Vivienne sighed, snapping her laptop shut. She couldn't focus. She walked over to the galley, poured a glass of San Pellegrino, and hesitated. She pulled a second glass from the cabinet, filling it with tap water, and grabbed a small carton of apple juice she kept for her diabetic board member. She walked over to the rug. "Do you want this?" Maya looked up. Her eyes were exactly like her father's, that same arresting, pale grey. She looked at the juice box, then up at Vivienne's perfectly tailored linen trousers and silk blouse. "Dad says I'm not supposed to take things from strangers unless they tell me their name," Maya piped up. Her front tooth was missing,
giving her a slight lisp. Vivienne blinked. "I'm Vivienne."
Like the fancy water. Maya pointed at the Pellegrino bottle on the counter. Evian, but close. Vivienne knelt, wincing as her knees cracked, and placed the juice box on a coaster beside the coloring book. "Your dad, does he always bring you to work?" "Only when Mrs. Gable gets sick or her car breaks. Dad says we have to adapt and overcome." "Yeah." Maya stabbed the tiny plastic straw into the juice box. "He says complaining doesn't fix the engine." Vivienne felt a strange, cold prickle at the back of her neck. It was the exact phrase she used in board meetings when her VPs started making excuses. Complaining doesn't fix the engine. It sounded entirely different coming from a 6-year-old on a yacht. The heavy steel hatch in the floor groaned open. Caleb hoisted himself up into the salon. He was covered in black soot from the chest down. Sweat was dripping off his nose. He looked exhausted, yet there was a coiled, relaxed energy in his shoulders that Vivienne secretly envied. Her own shoulders were permanently hiked up to her ears. "Don't bother her, Maya," Caleb grunted, grabbing a shop towel from his back pocket. "She brought me juice," Maya defended, holding up the box. Caleb paused. He looked at the juice, then at Vivienne. For the first time, she saw a crack in his indifferent armor. It was a brief look of genuine surprise, followed by a tight, guarded nod. "Thanks. You didn't have to." "I was getting a glass of water anyway," Vivienne said quickly, standing up and brushing invisible dust from her pants. "How is the engine?" Caleb walked over to the galley sink. He turned on the faucet, aggressively scrubbing his hands with a gritty orange pumice soap he'd brought with him. "The block is fine. The manifold was a mess, but I found a guy in Pompano who had a salvage part from a wrecked azimuth. I spent the morning machining it to fit your mounts." Vivienne frowned. "You machined a salvaged part? I told you I wanted new." Caleb shut off the water. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at her not like a billionaire, but like someone who had fundamentally misunderstood gravity. "You want new? You wait a month. You want to leave by Friday. You take my machined part. It's stronger than the factory cast anyway." He tilted his head, studying her face. It was an uncomfortable sensation, being observed by him. There was no deference in it. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Make impossible demands and then complain when someone actually figures out how to meet them." Vivienne bristled. "I expect perfection. It's how I run my businesses, and it's how I expect the people I hire to operate." "Yeah, well, boats aren't businesses. They're salt, steel, and pressure. They break. Perfection doesn't exist out here." He grabbed the glass of tap water she had poured earlier and drained it in one long swallow. He set the glass down with a soft click. "You look tired, Vivienne." The sound of her first name in his mouth, low, gravelly, completely stripped of honorifics, hit her like a physical blow. No one told her she looked tired. They told her she looked sharp. They told her she looked formidable. She wanted to snap at him. She wanted to remind him of his place, of her net worth, of the fact that she could buy this entire marina and pave it over. But as she looked at him, smelling the sharp tang of metal and sweat, watching his massive chest rise and fall, the anger just wasn't there. Only a deep, aching exhaustion. "I have a company to run," she said, her voice dropping a fraction. "I don't have time to be anything but tired." Caleb watched her for a second longer.
He reached out, his knuckles brushing against the edge of her laptop on the table. Right. Well, try to breathe. The boat will be ready. He turned and dropped back down the hatch, leaving the smell of diesel and ozone lingering in the cold, air-conditioned air. Vivian stood there for a long time, staring at the empty glass he had left on the counter, her heart beating a slightly different rhythm than it had that morning. By Thursday afternoon, the sky over Fort Lauderdale had turned a bruised, violent purple. A summer squall was rolling in, dropping the barometric pressure so rapidly it made Vivian's ears pop. The yacht was silent. The hammering had stopped an hour ago. Vivian sat on the curved leather sofa in the salon, her laptop open, but the screen had gone dark. She was aggressively chewing on the end of a very expensive pen. The merger was done. Robert had finalized the paperwork at 1 p.m. She had won. She had absorbed a competitor, added $3 billion to her company's valuation, and secured her legacy for another decade. She felt absolutely nothing. Well, not nothing. She felt a low-level, buzzing anxiety that had nothing to do with corporate takeovers and everything to do with the man currently washing his hands at her galley sink. Caleb wiped his face with a towel. The repairs were finished. The engines hummed flawlessly. He had started the generators, balanced the loads, and run a diagnostic that came back perfectly clean. Maya was asleep in the guest cabin down the hall, exhausted from a morning spent hunting for crabs on the dock. It was over. The transaction was complete. He was going to pack his tools, take his kid, and leave. Vivian hated the hollow sensation expanding in her chest. She hated it because it was irrational. "I left the invoice on the counter," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the cabin. Vivian stood up, smoothing her skirt. She walked over to the galley island and picked up the single piece of paper. It was a standard, slightly rumpled receipt book page. The handwriting was sharp, all block letters. She looked at the total and frowned. $3,500? That's just for parts and basic labor. That's what the job cost. Caleb began throwing wrenches into his red metal toolbox, organizing them by size without looking. "I told you to name your price. You engineered a custom fit in 3 days. A standard yard would have charged me 20 grand just for the rush fee." Vivian pulled her checkbook from her bag. "I'm giving you 25. Caleb slammed the lid of the toolbox shut. The metallic crack made Vivian flinch. He leaned across the island, his grey eyes narrowing. "I didn't do it for a tip. I charged you for my time and my materials. I don't want your charity." "It's not charity, it's compensation for value," she argued, feeling her pulse spike. Why was he fighting her on this? Everyone wanted her money. It was the only currency she knew how to use. "You're a single father. Maya needs clothes, school, whatever kids need. Take the money. Maya has everything she needs." His voice was dangerously quiet. "Don't project your obsession with capital onto my kid." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. Through the massive glass windows of the salon, the sky finally broke. Rain didn't just fall, it slammed into the yacht in a deafening, torrential sheet. The wind howled, violently rocking the 120-foot vessel against its mooring lines. The sudden darkness in the cabin was broken only by the flash of lightning. They were trapped, at least until the squall passed. Caleb exhaled a long breath, the tension leaving his shoulders. He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking incredibly weary. He walked over to the galley counter and hoisted himself up, sitting on the edge of the granite, letting his legs dangle. "We're going to be here a minute," he muttered, looking out at the driving rain. Vivian didn't know what to do with her hands. She set the checkbook down. The silence between them stretched, thick and complicated, filled only by the drumming of rain against the fiberglass hull. She looked at him, really looked at him. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, where it was damp with sweat. The relaxed, confident way he occupied space. Her eyes drifted to his jacket, draped over one of the dining chairs. A piece of paper was sticking out of the pocket. Not a receipt, not a mechanical diagram. It was a printed spreadsheet. Vivian frowned. She took a step closer to the chair. Her eyes, trained for decades to scan documents at a glance, picked up the bold headings before she even realized what she was doing. Quarterly projections, Pan-Pacific freighting, transatlantic tariffs, TEU container deficits. She froze. These weren't the finances of a local marina. This was high-level, macroeconomic, global supply chain data. The kind of data her own analysts paid tens of thousands of dollars to access. The kind of data that only executives at Tier 1 shipping conglomerates ever saw. She looked from the paper to Caleb. He was watching the storm, his profile illuminated by a sudden, jagged flash of lightning. "What were you doing before you became a mechanic?" Vivian asked. The question slipped out before she could stop it. Her voice sounded strange, fragile. Caleb didn't look at her. "I've always been a mechanic. I like fixing things that are broken." "Don't lie to me." She pointed a trembling finger at the jacket. "I know what a TEU tariff report looks like. My analysts use them. A grease monkey in Fort Lauderdale doesn't casually carry around proprietary global shipping data in his coat pocket." Caleb slowly turned his head. The indifferent, tired mask was gone. In its place was a sharp, calculating intelligence that made Vivian's breath catch in her throat. It was the look of a shark, the look of a man who owned the room. He hopped down off the counter. He didn't look like a guy in duct-taped boots anymore. He looked entirely dangerous. He walked slowly toward her, closing the distance until he was only inches away. The smell of ozone and rain clung to him. Vivian had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You're right, Vivian," Caleb said softly, the rumble of his voice vibrating in the small space between them. "I do like fixing broken things." He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing against the lapel of her silk blouse, sending a jolt of pure electricity straight down her spine. "But you assume I'm the one who needs fixing." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Vivian caught a fleeting glimpse of the caller ID Board of Directors. Urgent. Caleb silenced the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving hers. "I told you I'd fix your boat by Friday," he whispered, his gaze dropping momentarily to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "I believe you promised me something in return." Rain battered the reinforced glass of the salon, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against a window pane. Vivian stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the silk rug. She barely kept her balance, grabbing the back of a leather armchair. The sudden, suffocating proximity of him, the smell of rain and honest sweat mixed with the terrifying sharpness in his eyes,
shattered her practiced composure. "Who are you?" The words tore from her throat, raspy and completely lacking their usual authority. Caleb didn't step forward again, but his presence seemed to fill the entire cabin, expanding into the corners, pressing the oxygen out of the room. He ran a hand through his damp hair, the grease stains on his knuckles stark against his pale skin. "Caleb Hayes," he said quietly. Vivian's mind, a steel trap for names and corporate structures, instantly categorized it. Hayes, the quiet, elusive majority shareholder of Atlas Marine Logistics, the conglomerate that controlled 30% of the freight moving through the Panama Canal. A man notoriously absent from charity galas, industry summits, and the Forbes lists he legally forced his way off of. He was a ghost in the financial sector, a very, very wealthy ghost. "Atlas," she breathed, her fingers digging into the soft Italian leather of the chair. "You're Atlas." "I am," Caleb agreed, his tone utterly neutral. "Though lately, I prefer the title of head mechanic at Slip 44. The absurdity of it hit her like a physical blow. A hysterical, ugly laugh bubbled up in her chest. She clamped a hand over her mouth, fighting it down, but a jagged breath escaped. "You let me offer you $25,000, she said, her voice rising in pitch, teetering on the edge of manic. "You stood there, covered in diesel soot, and let me lecture you about capital. You watched me wave a checkbook at a man whose company's market cap dwarfs mine by a factor of 3. I didn't let you do anything, Vivian. You made assumptions." Caleb leaned against the galley island again, the predatory edge softening back into that infuriating, weary calm. "You walked onto my dock, assumed my life was defined by the dirt on my hands, and tried to buy my compliance. I just fixed the engine." "Why?" she practically shouted, gesturing wildly at the heavy steel hatch in the floor. "Why are you down there turning wrenches on my boat? Why are you covered in grease in a run-down marina when you have a penthouse in Monaco?" Caleb looked away. He watched the lightning fracture the purple sky over the harbor. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thumping of the rain and the soft, breathing hum of the generator he had just repaired. "Because steel makes sense," he finally said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it over the storm. "Because when a bearing spins, it's broken. You diagnose it, you machine a new part, you torque it down, and it works. It's honest." He turned his head, his grey eyes locking onto hers. The raw vulnerability in them made Vivian want to look away, but she was entirely paralyzed. "5 years ago, I sat in a boardroom in Geneva," Caleb continued, his voice tightening. "I negotiated a hostile takeover of a Mediterranean shipping line. I ruined a dozen families, gutted a century-old company, and increased my net worth by $2 billion before lunch. My phone rang while I was shaking hands on the deal." He paused, swallowing hard. The muscles in his jaw ticked. "It was the hospital. My wife had suffered a massive aneurysm. By the time I got my private jet in the air, she was gone." Maya was 14 months old. Vivian felt the air vanish from her lungs. The anger that had been keeping her upright dissolved, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its wake. She lowered her hand from the chair, suddenly hyper-aware of the expensive silk clinging to her skin, the heavy gold watch on her wrist. It all felt like armor that couldn't stop a bullet. "I spent the next 2 years trying to buy the grief away," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "I bought houses, cars, companies. I worked 80-hour weeks. I hired 3 nannies for Maya. And one day, I came home to my $30 million estate, and my own daughter hid behind the couch because she didn't recognize my face. He pushed off the counter, taking a slow step toward her. So, I walked away. I appointed a proxy board. I bought this dilapidated marina under a shell company. I bought a rusted-out trawler, and I started fixing things. He stopped 3 feet away from her. It took me 2 years of smelling like diesel fuel and scrubbing bottom paint to finally look in the mirror and not hate the guy staring back. It took 2 years for Maya to run to the door when I came home. Vivienne stared at him. The sharp ache behind her left eye was completely gone. In its place was a profound, terrifying clarity. She looked at this man, billionaire, mechanic, father, widower, and saw a mirror reflecting the exact hollow reality she had been running from for a decade. "You think I'm a monster," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash in her mouth. "You looked at me these past 3 days, screaming into my phone, throwing money at you, and you saw the person you used to be." Caleb didn't deny it. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gently closing over her trembling fingers. His skin was warm, rough, grounding. "I saw someone drowning," he corrected softly. "I saw someone who thinks if she just paddles hard enough, buys enough lifeboats, acquires enough oceans, she won't sink." His thumb brushed the back of her hand. "You're tired, Vivienne. I know that kind of tired. It goes all the way down to the bone." Tears, hot and entirely unbidden, prickled the corners of her eyes. She hated them. She hadn't cried since her father's funeral. She tried to pull her hand away, desperate to rebuild the walls, to reinstate the boardroom hierarchy. But his grip, though gentle, was immovable. "You made a deal," Caleb murmured, a slight, sad smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Fix the boat by Friday, and you'll marry me. Half your estate." "I was joking," she choked out, a tear spilling over her lashes, tracing a hot path down her cheek. "I know." Caleb reached up with his free hand, his rough thumb catching the tear before it reached her jawline. The contrast of his mechanic's hands against her skin was a sensory overload, friction and heat, grit and tenderness. But out here on the docks, a deal is a deal. I held up my end. "What do you want from me, Caleb?" The question was a surrender, raw, imperfect, devoid of negotiations or leverage. "I want you to stop running," he said. "Take your boat to the Bahamas, drink your expensive champagne, sit in the sun. And when you realize it's completely silent and you're entirely alone and the money doesn't make the exhaustion go away." He stepped back, letting her hand slip from his grasp. The loss of his heat made her shiver. "When you realize that," he finished, walking over to his red toolbox and grabbing the handle, "you know where my slip is." He didn't wait for a response. He opened the heavy glass salon doors, stepping out into the driving rain, hauling the heavy steel box effortlessly over the gunnel. The storm swallowed him instantly. Vivienne stood in the center of the pristine, silent cabin. Beneath her feet, the perfectly tuned engines hummed a steady, flawless rhythm. She had never felt so utterly broken in her entire life. Sunlight bleached the teak decks of the Paragon, reflecting off the crystal-clear azure waters of the Exumas. It was Saturday afternoon. A gentle, 80-degree breeze carried the scent of coconut oil and roasted grouper from the private beach club a half-mile away. It was paradise.
It was precisely what she had paid for. Vivienne sat in a lounge chair on the aft deck, a glass of vintage Dom Perignon sweating in her hand. Below her, 3 of her executives and their spouses were splashing in the water, laughing loudly at a joke someone had made about a competitor's falling stock price. She took a sip of the champagne. It tasted like battery acid. Everything was perfect. The merger was dominating the financial news cycle. Her stock was up 12%. The engine of the Paragon hadn't so much as hiccuped on the 200-mile crossing. Caleb's machined manifold was a masterpiece of engineering, and she was miserable. She watched the water ripple, feeling a suffocating pressure in her chest that rivaled the Fort Lauderdale squall. She tried to read a quarterly report on her tablet, but the words blurred into meaningless corporate jargon. Synergy, optimization, liquidity. They were empty syllables. For 48 hours, she hadn't been able to wash the smell of ozone and pumice soap out of her memory. She kept feeling the phantom weight of Caleb's calloused thumb against her jaw. She kept hearing the devastating, quiet certainty in his voice. I saw someone drowning. Vivienne, Robert, her VP of acquisitions, yelled from the water, holding up a dripping beer. We're heading to the beach club for oysters. You coming? Vivienne looked at him. She looked at his expensive sunglasses, his forced, sycophantic smile, the way he constantly checked his waterproof phone even while treading water. She saw herself. No, Vivienne said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. She set the champagne glass down on the teak table. She didn't look back at the water. She walked into the salon, grabbing the radio microphone mounted near the helm. Captain, she said, pressing the transmit button. Yes, Miss Vivienne? The voice crackled back from the bridge. Pull the tenders up. Recall the guests. We're turning around. There was a long pause. Ma'am, we just anchored 3 hours ago. I am aware of the time, Captain. Start the engines. We're going back to Fort Lauderdale. She dropped the microphone. Her hands were shaking, but not from anxiety. It was adrenaline, a terrifying, exhilarating rush of pure, unadulterated freefall. The crossing back took 10 hours. Vivienne didn't sleep. She stood on the aft deck in the dark, feeling the vibration of the perfectly tuned diesels beneath her bare feet. The salt spray coated her skin, making it tight and itchy. She didn't care. For the first time in years, she didn't care about the humidity ruining her hair or the wrinkles forming in her linen trousers. By the time the Paragon pulled back into the commercial marina early Monday morning, the Florida heat was already oppressive. The smell of low tide and rotting kelp hit her like a physical wall. It smelled like reality. She didn't wait for the deckhands to secure the spring lines. She climbed over the gunwale, dropping 3 feet onto the cracked concrete dock. She stumbled, catching herself, and ignored the sharp pain in her ankle. She walked down the pier, past the luxury slips, past the charter boats, heading straight for the industrial side of the harbor. Slip 44. He was there. Caleb was on the deck of the rusted trawler, a grinder in his hands, sending a shower of bright orange sparks into the muggy air. He was wearing a faded grey t-shirt stained with sweat and oil. Maya was sitting on a cooler nearby, attempting to untangle a massive knot of fishing line. Vivienne stopped at the edge of the slip. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. She had no strategy, no boardroom tactics, no checkbook in her pocket. She had left her Birkin bag and her Audemars watch on the yacht.
She was just a woman, standing on a dirty dock, terrified out of her mind. "Caleb," she called out. The grinder shut off, winding down with a high-pitched whine. Caleb pushed his safety glasses up onto his forehead. He looked at her. He took in her bare feet, the salt-stained linen pants, the dark circles under her eyes, and the messy, unstyled hair whipping around her face in the harbor breeze. He didn't look surprised. He set the grinder down and hopped off the trawler, landing on the dock with a heavy thud. He walked slowly toward her, stopping a foot away. The smell of metal dust and sweat washed over her, making her breath catch. "You're back early," he noted, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Engine give you trouble?" "The engine is perfect," Vivian said, her voice cracking slightly. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "The engine isn't the problem." Caleb tilted his head, watching her carefully. "Then what is?" Vivian let out a shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a second, dismantling the final load-bearing wall of her ego. When she opened them, the tears were there again. But this time, she didn't fight them. She let them fall, hot and messy, cutting tracks through the dried salt on her face. "I have $10 billion, she whispered, her voice raw and jagged. "I have a house in Aspen, a penthouse in New York, and a boat that I just drove halfway across the ocean to get away from a life I built with my own bare hands." She stepped closer to him. She reached out, her trembling fingers gripping the heavy, oil-stained cotton of his t-shirt. "And I have never been more exhausted in my entire life," she admitted, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You were right. I'm drowning. I'm drowning, Caleb. And I don't know how to swim in this water anymore. I don't know how to stop." Caleb's expression softened, the hard lines of his face giving way to something profoundly gentle. He looked down at her hands gripping his shirt, then back up at her tear-streaked face. "You offered me a deal, Caleb," she choked out, a wet, self-deprecating laugh escaping her lips. "You said you'd fix my boat, but I'm the one who needs fixing. Please, I don't know how to do this, but please, teach me how to breathe down here." It was a total surrender. She was begging, not for her life, not for her money, but for her soul. Caleb didn't say a word. He wrapped his massive, rough hands around her wrists, gently prying her fingers from his shirt. For a split second, a spike of pure terror pierced her chest. He was going to push her away. He was going to tell her she was too far gone. Instead, he slid his hands up her arms, pulling her firmly against his chest. Vivienne gasped as she hit the solid wall of his body. He wrapped his arms around her back, burying his face in her messy, salt-stiffened hair. The heat radiating off him was immense. The smell of oil, metal, and the sea enveloped her completely. "Okay," Caleb whispered against her ear, his voice rough with emotion. "I've got you. We'll start with the rust, and we'll work our way up." "Dad," a small voice interrupted. Vivienne flinched, pulling back slightly. Caleb kept one arm securely around her waist as they both turned to look at the trawler. Maya was standing on the deck, holding up a perfectly untangled fishing line, a huge, gap-toothed smile on her face. She looked from her father to Vivienne, her pale grey eyes squinting in the bright Florida sun. "Is the fancy water lady going to stay for lunch?" Maya yelled over the sound of a passing skiff. "Mrs. Gable made tuna sandwiches." Caleb looked down at Vivienne. The shadow of his past grief was still there in his eyes, but it was edged with a new, bright light, a spark of genuine amusement and hope. "What do you think?" he asked her softly, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You negotiate billion-dollar mergers. Do you think you can handle a tuna sandwich on a rusted boat?" Vivienne looked at his calloused hands, then at the bright, chaotic marina, and finally back at the man who had completely dismantled her world in 3 days. A real smile, the first one she had felt in a decade, broke across her face. "It's a deal," she said. "Did Vivienne's emotional surrender catch you off guard, or did you see Caleb's true identity coming? If this raw, grounded story of finding peace over profit kept you hooked, hit that like button right now. Share this drama with a friend who loves a good plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intense, true-to-life storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you trade a billionaire lifestyle for honest peace? Let's talk about it.